Konnichiwa. My name is Jeffrey Smith, and I'm excited to share with you information about the health dangers of genetically engineered foods, Roundup herbicide, and particularly the new dangers that are posed by the new generation of genetically modified foods, including gene editing. I'm going to share some slides with you on these dangers. We've been investigating the health dangers of GMOs and Roundup, I personally, for 24 years. And I wanted to share with you a summary of what we have discovered. There's been a repeating pattern of damage to lab animals that are fed GMOs or the Roundup herbicide that is sprayed on most GMOs. For humans, they report getting better after switching to an organic and therefore non-GMO diet that is not sprayed with Roundup. The livestock and pet problems associated with being fed GMOs and the changes that occur when they switch off of GMOs, how improved their health is, and also the disease rates in the United States seem to follow a pattern parallel with the increased use of GMOs and Roundup. I have surveyed 150 different audiences about what people noticed when they switched to non-GMO and largely organic food, and they shared many different conditions that improved. So we did a survey of 3,256 people who also reported getting better from these same 28 different conditions. And you can see that 85% of those surveyed reported getting better from digestive problems. There was also fatigue, overweight, brain fog, mood or problems like anxiety and depression, food allergies, memory and concentration, joint pain, seasonal allergies. You can see the list. It's rather comprehensive. Now, if you look at the rates of disease in the United States, this, for example, is inflammatory bowel disease, you can compare it to that orange line, which is the amount of Roundup or glyphosate-based herbicides. Glyphosate is the main poison in Roundup. How much has been sprayed on genetically modified soy and corn. And you can see that the inflammatory bowel disease rose in parallel with the increased use of Roundup. Now, this is correlational. It doesn't prove that one causes the other, but we actually have much more evidence that, in fact, it probably does. I'm going to go through about 30 slides very quickly. If you would just look at the slide graph itself, I will name the disease so that you can see which disease has a similar slope. Deaths due to intestinal infection, peritonitis, bile duct and liver cancer, kidney and pelvic cancer, bladder, urinary and bladder cancer, thyroid cancer, deaths due to acute myeloid leukemia, kidney failure, death, acute kidney injury, hepatitis C, autism prevalence among 6-year-olds, diabetes. This is deaths due to leukemia, or to stroke, to dementia, deaths from senile dementia, deaths from Alzheimer's, deaths from Parkinson's, deaths from obesity, deaths from hypertension, anemia, insomnia, sleep disorders, celiac disease, birth defects, deaths due to disorders of lipoprotein metabolism, anxiety, suicide by overdose, and schizophrenia, ADHD. Now, Roundup is not only sprayed on most genetically modified crops, most GMO crops are Roundup ready, engineered not to die when sprayed with Roundup. But Roundup and glyphosate-based herbicides are also sprayed on a variety of food products in the field just before harvest to dry down the crops. It kills the crops, but it dries it down and kills the weeds at the same time. And that's fine for the farmers, but it's not a good idea for us to eat the products that have been sprayed, because it's actually throughout the food supply. It's in the grains and the beans, it's in wine and beer and orange juice. And what I want to share with you now, what we know about glyphosate, the chief poison in Roundup. It turns out it's quite dangerous, and it alone could explain the mechanics of how it functions on the body, as you'll see, could explain every one of those graphs, as well as the 28 different conditions that people reported getting better from. Now, GMOs, what we know about GMOs, could also explain a lot of those problems, but there's not as much research on GMOs, so we'll spend more time now on glyphosate. Glyphosate deletes minerals or depletes minerals. It makes them unavailable to use because it chelates or grabs onto the minerals, making them unavailable. That is related to many different diseases. Glyphosate damages the digestive system. It is toxic to the energy centers of the body, called the mitochondria, and mitochondria problems are linked to cancer and shorter lifespan and numerous diseases. It promotes birth defects. It is an endocrine disruptor and can damage the relationship of our hormones at higher concentrations. It can impair the ability for the cells to detox, in other words, to release toxins. It also can impair the liver's ability to detox toxins. So all of the other toxins in the body can become amplified in their impact if glyphosate blocks their detoxification. Glyphosate separates the cells, between the cells, the tight junctions, and that's in the gut called leaky gut. It also can create leaky brain and leaky organs. Leaky gut alone is linked to allergies, inflammation, autoimmune disease. One Harvard professor described it as the source of all disease. Glyphosate is an antibiotic. It's actually patented as an antibiotic, and it's been found to kill the beneficial bacteria inside our intestines, but not the pathogenic bacteria. The changes that occur in the gut microbiome are very significant, because we now know that the microbiome health is related to the health of our body and the prevention of many diseases. Most diseases have problems in the microbiome that either preempt or begin the disease or are created by and with the disease. Glyphosate's changes could predict many of the diseases that we saw on the charts. One researcher injected Roundup into pregnant mice and found that those mice were fine. Their offspring were fine. But there was a change in the sperm cells that passed down from generation to generation. So the grandchildren suffered more than the children. But the generation that suffered the most was the great-grandchildren. 90% of them had serious diseases, prostate problems, kidney problems, obesity, and a lot of deaths during pregnancy. This shows what's called epigenetic changes, where the genes don't change, but different genes are expressed differently because of an environmental influence. In this case, it was glyphosate. Glyphosate also promotes cancer. This was made clear by the International Agency for Research on Cancer that declared that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. They said that it definitely causes cancer in animals, and they didn't have enough research on humans to verify that it causes cancer in humans, but there was sufficient evidence to say that it probably does. It causes the changes in the DNA, which can lead to cancer. There's plenty of animal studies that show it causes cancer in animals. And where it is used in high concentrations, there's an increase of cancer in the population. Bayer, a company in Germany, a pharmaceutical and agricultural company, purchased Monsanto. And soon after they purchased it, a lawsuit began against Bayer, against Monsanto, now owned by Bayer, claiming that a groundskeeper in the San Francisco Bay Area got a deadly case of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma after using Roundup. And the jury concluded that it was the Roundup that caused his cancer. They also concluded that Monsanto had acted maliciously and hid the evidence from this particular groundskeeper and from the public. In fact, the trials showed evidence of fraudulent practices for decades, and the jury awarded the plaintiff $289 million. A later jury also found Monsanto guilty, and another jury, a third one, not only found Monsanto guilty, but they awarded $2 billion to the plaintiffs just for punitive damages because of the outrageous ways that Monsanto had acted. Judges reduced the amount of the awards, but now there is a settlement that's being considered between Bayer and about 125,000 plaintiffs who are planning to sue Bayer if they don't settle. Now, the proposed settlement was about $11 billion, and it may be that the settlement which was announced is now falling apart. We don't know if it's going to go through, but the evidence that came out in the trial was devastating, showing so much evidence that Roundup does cause cancer and that Monsanto continued to hide that evidence year after year. I want to now turn our attention to the new GMOs and the new global threat from GMOs. It's an existential threat in that genetic engineering, when it creates a new organism that's released in the environment, that organism can replicate. It can cross with non-GMO relatives and create offspring, passing on to future generations the change in the genetic code. Now, genetic engineering, the number one most common result is surprise side effects. You can create hundreds or thousands of mutations up and down the DNA from a single insertion of a gene. That corrupted gene pool can become part of nature. Now, there are new types of GMOs, gene editing, where you can alter genes very inexpensively. You can buy a do-it-yourself kit online for $169 US and make your own bacterial organisms and release them into the environment where the changes in the gene will be passed on to bacteria all over, perhaps all over the planet. And if you think about how cheap and easy it is, and that there's potential profit to be made by altering organisms, now you realize that tens of thousands of laboratories equipped with this technique could be targeting everything that has DNA, from algae to animals, butterflies to bees, everything. And that if we don't stop it, we will replace nature, and future generations will not inherit the products of the billions of years of evolution, but instead the products of laboratory creations that are prone to side effects. As an example of what types of GMOs are being released right now, Florida, in the south part of Florida, in the Keys, just approved a release of 750 million mosquitoes over the next 2 years. I tried to stop that release. In fact, 10 years ago, I argued, and we were successful 10 years ago, but it came back up. I argued with the one of the chief scientists of the company, Oxitec, that they had never even tested the saliva of the biting mosquitoes, because the saliva would enter the skin, into the bloodstream of human beings. And it turns out they never did the proper tests. And so they may be creating havoc not only in the environment, but also in anyone that gets bitten by one of these mosquitoes. There were many, many scientists lined up against this release, but it was voted by a 5-person panel from the Mosquito Control Board, none of whom were scientists with the ability to evaluate the impact from these mosquitoes. The same type of mosquitoes, or similar, were released by the company Oxitec in Brazil after promising that these mosquitoes, which were designed to lower the population of this particular type of mosquito by creating sterile offspring, it turns out it didn't work the way they planned. And now the entire mosquito population of the area has a corrupted gene pool with genes both from the local mosquitoes and the introduced genetically engineered varieties. This shows that the releases that we do now can last generation after generation. There was a genetically engineered bacterium that was almost released in the early 1990s. And it was designed to convert plant matter into alcohol to be used by farmers to turn the residues of the crops at the end of the growing season into alcohol that they could use to power their tractors. They were then to be instructed to spread the sludge at the bottom of these barrels that contain the bacterium onto their fields as fertilizer. Fortunately, they never released it because a graduate student who happened to be testing this genetically engineered microbe discovered that it rendered the soil infertile. It destroyed the roots by turning them into alcohol. We now know that bacteria, when it's genetically engineered, can spread around the world. We know that viruses can do that. We've all had the experience of the pandemic. Bacteria can also spread around the world. One scientist who was very involved in this research said that if that bacteria had gotten out, it could theoretically end terrestrial plant life. This gives a demonstration of the power of genetic engineering in relationship to one single species. In the 1980s, another species of bacteria was almost released, and that could have theoretically altered the weather patterns on the planet because it was designed to disrupt the normal natural bacteria in its ability to create from moisture frost and rain and snow. The purpose of this bacterium was to prevent frost on strawberries and potatoes to save farmers money. But that same bacteria is found in the atmosphere and controls the weather patterns. So if this genetically altered bacteria had outperformed and spread, replacing its natural counterpart, the weather patterns could theoretically have been changed forever in the world. We know that there are companies right now planning to introduce genetically modified bacteria onto the fields in the United States, which could easily spread to Japan and around the world. Not only could that affect change in the environment, but as we talked about, our own microbiome, including our gut bacteria, is essential for health. One of the ways that bacteria propagate and work with each other is they swap genes. So the genetically engineered genes that are incorporated into soil bacteria that are genetically engineered and released in the United States may end up inside the intestines of the children in Japan. We know that gene editing has been touted by the biotech industry as safe and predictable. It turns out it's not true. One of their models that they claimed was a big success was creating cows gene edited to not have horns. They wanted to pack many of these cows together in factory farms, and they didn't want them to hurt each other with large horns. So they genetically engineered, using gene editing, a way to stop a certain gene from expressing. the biotech industry declared it a success and claimed that no government anywhere should ever regulate gene-edited animals because this proved it was a success. The Food and Drug Administration, 2 years later, accidentally discovered that the company got it wrong. They never did a proper research test on the genes from the cows, and it turns out there were bacterial genes in there that created antibiotic-resistant genes or proteins, which means that if these cows had been widely introduced, and there was plans for that, it could have theoretically promoted antibiotic-resistant diseases in the population, which already results in tens of thousands of deaths and many, many amputations. Another research study showed that the process of genetic engineering with gene editing, what happens is you introduce genetic material that looks for a certain part of the genome, and then another part of the gene editing apparatus makes a cut. So you're trying to cut certain places in the genome. You not only accidentally cut many other places that you don't intend, but wherever you cut, when the cells organize the repair, they can bring DNA from the environment. In this case, there was serum in the petri dish from goats and cows, and there was DNA in that serum, and the cellular mechanism put goat or cow DNA into the mouse DNA that was never intended. They put retroviruses in there. Retroviruses can be like AIDS or HIV or like hepatitis. So it's a way that we might be inadvertently creating disease. There's also a technology called gene drives where you can actually wipe out an entire species by forcing all of the offspring of those species to have certain traits that could ultimately change those species or destroy them. There are also crops that are engineered specifically with RNA, not DNA, to silence DNA. There are genetically modified apples and potatoes already on the market in the United States, engineered to use RNA to block the expression of certain genes so that when you slice the apple or potato, it doesn't turn brown. But we also know, unfortunately, that the double-stranded RNA of the type that they're using can affect other species if it gets exposed to it. So eating that apple or eating that potato could theoretically damage or reprogram our own DNA. In 1859, in Australia, a group that was catering to immigrants from the UK wanted to make the immigrants feel more at home. And so they released on Christmas Day 24 rabbits because they had a habit of hunting rabbits. We have an expression in the United States, multiplying like rabbits, because rabbits multiply like rabbits, they reproduce. This one simple act with good intention in the mid-1800s was devastating for the entire continent. By the 1920s, they estimated there was over 10 billion rabbits in Australia because there are no natural predators. We have a very small awareness in time and space as humans. We want to release one thing for the good of, to make people feel more at home, and it influences the entire continent and all future generations, and not just of humans, but the entire ecosystem. Imagine for a moment replacing not just one or introducing not just one new species, but replacing every species through a technology whose number one most common result is surprise side effects. Imagine the catastrophes or cataclysms that we could be thrusting onto future generations. We know so little about the impact of gene editing. The biotech industry is ignoring more than a dozen very serious studies that show different ways that gene editing can be harmful and even deadly. They have convinced the Japanese government to not regulate gene-edited organisms. They've convinced the Australian government, the US government, the Argentinian, the Brazilian, and others. And yet there are numerous independent scientists who are up in arms because of the possibility that the introduction of these untested and unsafe GMOs could change the nature of nature. I ask that you share this information with others and work with us to try and establish new laws and a new understanding about genetic engineering and the concerns that I've expressed today. I invite you to go to responsibletechnology.org and to sign up for our newsletter and to stay in touch with us, because we are going to mount a global campaign to protect nature. We've also shared with you a 3-minute video which describes some of the dangers that we're looking at generally. But future films that we're going to release will be more specific. They'll talk about some of the things we discussed today: the bacteria, the cows, the mice, and also human genetic engineering. We are at a time now where we have arrived at the inevitable moment in human history where we can easily redirect the streams of evolution for all time. It's important that we act as stewards for this generation, not just for humans, but for all living things, and also stewards for all generations in the future. Never before have humans had the ability to impact all living beings and all future generations. It is important now, in this time, that we take this opportunity to protect and steward all living things and all future generations. Thank you.
If we stop climate change, save our oceans, and protect our soils, we may still lose the natural world we cherish. A quiet invasion is underway, where companies who profit from altering DNA are declaring open season on all parts of nature. Like the gold rush of the Wild West, there is a global gene rush underway, moving from engineering crops to engineering entire ecosystems. From algae to animals, fungus to flowers, bacteria to bees. With genetic engineering techniques such as gene editing costing less than ever, nothing is off limits. Once released, GMOs reproduce. Artificial changes can spread through the environment and corrupt the gene pool. We have no strategies to clean it up. The only thing lasting longer than a permanently altered gene pool is extinction. Last century, the assault of synthetic chemicals polluted nature. Today's genetic assault could replace nature forever. What is the most common outcome of genetic engineering? Surprise side effects. It's not that individuals seek to permanently replace nature with unpredictable laboratory creations. It's thousands upon thousands of labs racing to get their invented organisms out there first. And many governments, including the US, Australia, Argentina, Brazil, and Japan, are eliminating regulations and safety precautions, hoping that GMO companies can make quick profits and dominate. On June 6th, the Trump administration proposed new rules that could make almost every GMO exempt from regulations by the Department of Agriculture. On June 11th, President Trump signed an executive order to further erode government oversight. In addition, it authorizes the US State Department, Trade Representative, and other agencies to work together to convince the world to accept GMOs, and by October 9th, have a strategy in place to use the maximum financial, political, and diplomatic pressure to arm twist the nations of the world into fully accepting America's GMOs. Do you think the citizens of the world will have something to say about that? We do. In fact, we invite you to join a global protest to say it loud and clear. It's time to blow the whistle, not just for our children and grandchildren, but for all living beings and all future generations. They're depending on us. Protect nature now.